Chapter 1. Whispers in the Dark. The moon hung low, its pale light struggling to pierce the dense canopy of the ancient forest. Beneath the tangled branches, the world was a tapestry of shadows, painted in hues of dread. Every step through the forest seemed louder than the last. Twigs cracked like bones, and the rustle of leaves overhead carried an unnatural cadence, like a chorus of whispers mocking the desperate figure running for his life. Aaron, a hunter from the nearby village of Mornshade, clutched his torch with trembling hands. The flame sputtered, its light feeble against the encroaching dark. He had ventured into the woods to find his missing son, a foolhardy attempt born of desperation. Now, he regretted every step that had brought him this far. The forest was no longer the place he had known, a home to familiar trails and game. It had become something else, something alive. The air was thick, stifling. Each breath tasted of rot and decay. Roots jutted from the ground like skeletal hands, their gnarled fingers grasping at Aaron's boots, tripping him again and again. He scrambled forward, his heart pounding louder than the unnatural rustling that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He dared not look back, though the sounds of pursuit grew closer, wet guttural growls and the snapping of branches under heavy, deliberate steps. "Please, gods, no!" Aaron gasped, his voice breaking as his legs threatened to give out. He stumbled into a small clearing, the torchlight revealing what little he wished to see. The trees around him writhed unnaturally, their bark split open to reveal what looked like pulsing veins. In the centre of the clearing, a patch of ground gleamed with a slick black substance that reeked of sulphur. And then he saw them, eyes in the dark, dozens of them. Red and unblinking, like embers set into the faces of nightmares. The creatures emerged slowly, as if savouring his terror. They were once wolves, their forms still bearing a shadow of their former selves, but now they were something else. Their jaws were elongated, filled with jagged teeth that dripped with the same black ichor staining the ground. Their limbs were twisted, bones jutting at unnatural angles. One had an extra head, malformed and snarling, its second set of jaws snapping at the air as though tasting his fear. Aaron backed away, raising the torch higher, though its flickering light only seemed to agitate the creatures. "Stay back!" he screamed, his voice breaking the oppressive silence of the clearing. For a moment the wolves hesitated, their movements stilted, almost mechanical, as though something unseen was pulling their strings. And then they attacked. Aaron's scream echoed through the forest, but it was short-lived. The wolves fell upon him with the ferocity of a storm, and the clearing was silent once more. The torch, its flame snuffed, lay forgotten in the blood-soaked grass. The only sound that remained was the soft rustling of the trees, their branches swaying as if in quiet applause. Far from the horrors of the forest, the half-ogre Riganthar knelt by the flickering glow of his hearth. The warmth of the fire cast long shadows across his modest hut, the walls lined with trophies of his past hunts, tusks, antlers and claws, each a story etched into his memory. Gurn, his massive dire boar, lay curled by the door, his heavy breaths filling the room. Riganthar sharpened his axe in silence, the rhythmic scrape of stone against steel the only sound. His eyes, sharp and green as a predator's, flicked toward the door when he heard a faint knock. Few dared approach his home unannounced. He stood, his towering frame casting a shadow over the room, and opened the door to reveal a frail figure wrapped in a threadbare cloak. The village elder looked up at him, her face pale and streaked with dirt. "Great hunter," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We need your help." Riganthar stepped aside, motioning for her to enter. She hesitated, casting wary glances at Gurn, whose steel-capped tusks gleamed in the firelight. The beast snorted but did not rise, its eyes half-lidded with disinterest. "What trouble brings you this far into the wilds?" Riganthar asked, his voice low and rough. "The forest," the elder began, clutching at her cloak as though it could shield her from the words she had to say. It's changing. People are disappearing. Hunters, farmers, even children. And those who return, they're not themselves. They speak of shadows that whisper, and creatures that shouldn't exist. Riganthar's eyes narrowed. He had noticed the changes too. The animals he hunted had grown scarce, and those he did find were wrong. Twisted, like the forest itself. "Why come to me?" he asked. "Because you are the only one who can help," the elder said, desperation bleeding into her voice. "The villagers are afraid. They won't even venture into the woods to find their lost loved ones. But you know the forest better than anyone. Please, great hunter, if this continues, we're all doomed." Riganthar said nothing for a long moment. He glanced at Gurn, who stirred, sensing his master's unease. Finally he spoke. "I'll look into it, but no promises." The elder bowed her head, tears glistening in her eyes. "Thank you." As she left, Riganthar retrieved his weapons and his cloak. He stepped outside, inhaling the crisp night air, tinged with the faint, sour scent of decay. The forest loomed in the distance, its silhouette a jagged line against the starless sky. "Come, Gurn," he said. The dire boar rose with a low grunt, following him into the dark. The whispers had begun again. Chapter 2. Into the Wilds. The forest loomed before Riganthar like a brooding sentinel, its gnarled canopy blotting out the sky. The air smelled wrong, thick and metallic, as if the earth itself bled. Riganthar adjusted the straps on his pack and gripped the reins of his dire boar, Gurn, whose snout twitched with unease. The beast huffed, his usual bravado tempered by the oppressive aura of the woods. "Steady, old friend," Riganthar murmured, his deep voice a rumble. He scratched Gurn's scarred flank and stepped forward, the boar following reluctantly. The first mile was quiet. Too quiet. Even in winter's chill, the forest should have hummed with the soft rustle of small creatures, the chirp of hidden birds. Instead, silence wrapped the woods in a suffocating shroud. Riganthar's every step crunched against the frost-laced earth, loud enough to make his skin prickle. He paused by a tree with bark that seemed off. At a glance, it resembled the weathered wood of any ancient forest sentinel. But as Riganthar leaned closer, the bark shifted, subtly but undeniably, forming ridges that looked disturbingly like the lines of a human face. He traced one finger along the grooves, and for an instant the ridges moved. A faint moan, low and agonized, slipped from the tree. Riganthar jerked back, hand flying to the axe at his belt. Gurn growled low, his tusks scraping the air as he pawed the ground. "It's spreading faster than I thought," Riganthar muttered, eyes narrowing. He glanced around, his hunter's instincts screaming that he was being watched. The deeper they ventured, the worse it became. Vines hung from the trees like entrails, their surfaces slick and pulsing faintly as if filled with liquid. Riganthar hacked through a particularly stubborn thicket, only to find the sap bleeding from the vines was black, thick as tar, and carried a stench that turned his stomach. "Corruption," he said aloud, his voice cutting through the dead air. "Old and deep." Gurn grunted in agreement, or perhaps protest, as they pressed forward. By midday, the first sign of something living appeared, a set of hoofprints in the frozen mud. Riganthar crouched beside them, his sharp eyes scanning their peculiar shape. Not a deer, too wide, too heavy. The edges of the prints glistened faintly, as if the creature had bled ichor with every step. Gurn sniffed at the tracks and recoiled with a sharp snort. Riganthar patted his side, grim but resolute. "We follow." They moved cautiously, the prints leading them deeper into the forest's belly. Shadows stretched long and clawed despite the high sun, and the whispers continued. At first, they were faint, like the murmurs of distant wind. But soon, they grew more distinct. Words in no language Riganthar recognised, a chorus of overlapping voices that seemed to rise and fall with his every step. "Pay it no mind," he said under his breath, though his hand never left the hilt of his axe. It wasn't long before the trail led them to a clearing, where the ground sank into a shallow pit. Riganthar and Gurn halted at its edge, both staring down in grim silence. At the centre of the pit lay the wolf, or what had been a wolf. Its body was mangled and bloated, its fur patchy and its skin bulging unnaturally, as if something inside had tried to claw its way out. Bone spines jutted from its back at irregular angles, glistening with fresh blood. Its eyes, glowing an unnatural red, stared unblinkingly at the sky. Riganthar knelt beside it, careful to keep his distance. The stench was unbearable, rot and sulphur and something he couldn't name. He poked at the beast's flank with the butt of his axe. The flesh gave too easily, as though it were only a loose bag containing something far too large. Then it twitched. Riganthar sprang back, axe in hand, just as the wolf let out a garbled snarl. Its broken body twisted unnaturally, snapping bones and sinew as it rose to its feet. "More corruption," Riganthar growled, more to himself than anyone else. The wolf lunged, its movements erratic but horrifyingly fast. Riganthar dodged, his reflexes honed from decades of survival. He swung his axe in a wide arc, the blade biting deep into the wolf's side. Black ichor sprayed from the wound, hissing as it hit the ground and leaving scars on the earth itself. Gurn charged, again and again his tusks ramming the wolf with the force of a battering ram. The beast howled as it was thrown against a tree, but even impaled on a low branch it thrashed and clawed. "Vile beast," Riganthar barked, driving his second axe into the wolf's skull. With a final gurgling shriek, the creature collapsed, its body dissolving into a puddle of black sludge that sank into the ground like spilled ink. Riganthar stood over the remains, breathing heavily. His axes dripped with the foul ichor, the stench clinging to the air. He wiped the blades on a patch of moss that turned brown and withered on contact. "This isn't natural," he muttered. He glanced at Gurn, whose flanks heaved from exertion. "We're not alone in this forest." The whispers returned, louder now, mocking and taunting. Riganthar straightened, his cold eyes scanning the trees. Somewhere in the darkness, something was watching. Waiting. "Let it wait," Riganthar said, his voice as unyielding as stone. He motioned to Gurn, and together they vanished into the oppressive shadows of the forest, pressing deeper into its corrupted heart. Chapter 3. The Druid's Warning. The forest deepened into a shadow-soaked silence as Riganthar pressed forward, his boots crunching over dead foliage that seemed to writhe beneath his steps. The air grew thicker and more oppressive, clinging to his lungs like wet cloth. Gurn grunted uneasily, its multiple sharp tusks gleaming faintly in the gloom. Riganthar rested a hand on the beast's flank, a silent reassurance that belied his own unease. The trees here loomed larger, their twisted trunks gnarled like clenched fists. Dark sap wept from splits in the bark, pooling in viscous puddles that reeked of decay. The leaves whispered faintly, not with the rustle of wind but with something darker, a susurrus of voices speaking no language Riganthar could recognise. It was near dusk when he first spotted the circle. A faint shimmer caught his eye through the underbrush, like moonlight trapped in glass. Gurn halted, snorting in agitation, the bristles along its back rising. Riganthar crouched, peering through the dense foliage. A grove stretched ahead, its boundary marked by a ring of standing stones etched with runes that pulsed faintly in shades of blue and green. Within the circle, the forest floor was unnaturally clear, the decay and corruption held at bay. Stepping into the grove felt like crossing an invisible threshold. The air lightened, though the oppressive weight of the surrounding forest lingered just beyond the stones. Riganthar remained still, scanning his surroundings with the hunter's instinct that had kept him alive for all his long years. "Who dares disturb this place?" The voice was a low rasp, like dead leaves dragged across stone. From behind one of the largest stones stepped a figure cloaked in moss and shadow. The druid was tall and thin, their face obscured by a hood stitched from animal hides and adorned with feathers, claws, and small bones. Their hands, long and skeletal, clutched a gnarled staff that hummed faintly with power. "I seek answers," Riganthar said evenly, rising to his full height. Despite his imposing figure, the druid did not flinch. Instead, they tilted their head, the movement bird-like and unnatural. "You bring the stench of the corrupted woods with you, hunter," the druid said, their voice laced with suspicion. "You tread too close to the heart of the poison." Riganthar stepped closer, his hand resting lightly on the handle of his axe. "I've seen the blight spreading through these woods, the creatures, the plants. It's not natural. What festers here?" The druid's hood shifted as they regarded him, silent for a long, heavy moment. Finally, they gestured toward the center of the grove. "Step closer, if you would hear the truth. But know this: knowledge comes at a price, and the forest does not easily release those who walk too deep." Riganthar followed the druid to a small altar made of black stone, its surface carved with intricate spirals that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. A faint hum emanated from the stone, a resonance that tugged at his very bones. The druid placed a hand on the altar, and the runes on the stones around the grove flared brighter, casting a ghostly light. "Centuries ago, a great evil was bound within this forest," the druid began. "Neros, the demon of desolation, was sundered in battle by heroes long forgotten. His body was scattered, his power broken, yet even a fragment of such darkness is enough to poison the land." Riganthar's expression hardened. "A fragment? You mean this corruption comes from a piece of him?" The druid nodded, their fingers trailing over the altar's surface. "The hand of Neros lies buried deep within the forest. Its power has seeped into the roots and soil, warping all it touches. The longer it remains, the stronger its influence grows. Soon, even this sanctuary will fall." Riganthar's grip tightened on his axe. "How can it be stopped?" The druid's hollow laughter echoed through the grove. "Stopped? You speak as though the forest were a beast to be slain. This is not a foe you can cut down with steel alone, hunter." They paused, then added, "The hand's power must be severed at the source. Destroy the artifact, and the corruption will die with it. But to reach it, you must brave the heart of darkness, where the forest itself will rise against you." "And if I don't?" Riganthar asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then this land will rot, and the corruption will spread until there is nothing left but shadows and screams." The druid reached into their robes and withdrew a scrap of leather on which a crude map had been drawn. They handed it to Riganthar, their fingers cold as stone. "This will guide you, but heed my warning. The whispers you hear, they are not mere tricks. They will twist your thoughts, turn your memories against you. The closer you get, the harder it will be to hold on to yourself." Riganthar took the map and tucked it into his belt. "I'll manage." The druid's voice softened, almost mournfully. "Bravery and stupidity are thinly divided. You will not emerge unchanged, hunter, if you emerge at all." As Riganthar turned to leave the grove, the druid called out one final warning. "Beware the glade where the trees weep blood. Beyond it lies only despair." The oppressive weight of the forest returned the moment he stepped past the stones. Behind him the grove dimmed, the faint light of its runes swallowed by the encroaching darkness. Riganthar tightened his grip on Gurn's reins, his thoughts heavy. Ahead lay answers, and perhaps his end. Chapter 4. Shadows of the Past. The air grew ever heavier as Riganthar and Gurn ventured deeper into the heart of the forest. The ancient trees in this part of the forest stood unnaturally still, their towering forms arching together as if conspiring to blot out every trace of light. A thick canopy hung overhead, swallowing the faint glow of day, leaving Riganthar to navigate in the dim green twilight. Now the ground beneath his boots squelched with each step, oozing a dark, viscous sap that smelled faintly of decay. Gurn snorted, his massive tusks glinting faintly in the murky gloom. The dire boar pawed at the earth nervously, his usual confidence replaced by a low, guttural growl. The great hunter paused, resting a calloused hand on Gurn's flank. "Easy, boy," he muttered, his voice a rough whisper that seemed too loud in the oppressive stillness. The whispers had started again, faint and fragmented, like the wind threading through broken reeds. The whispers slithered around Riganthar, brushing the edges of his mind. They were not words, not quite, but suggestions, a chorus of unspoken fears, doubts and guilt. He clenched his jaw and pressed on, the weight of his weapons comforting at his sides. The forest here had changed. Vines hung from the trees like veins, their surfaces glistening with something thick and red. Some pulsed faintly, as if alive. The once familiar wildflowers were now grotesque parodies of themselves. Blossoms curled inward, revealing jagged, tooth-like structures where petals should be. Riganthar knelt to examine one such flower. As his finger brushed its surface, it snapped shut with a suddenness that made even him flinch, releasing a puff of black spores into the air. Gurn sneezed violently and backed away, his nostrils flaring. "I don't like it either," Riganthar muttered, wiping his hand on his cloak. As they moved forward, the whispers grew bolder, threading through the silence like venom in a wound. Riganthar's step faltered as the voices coalesced into something coherent. "Why didn't you save him?" He froze. The words were sharp, jagged things, dredged from the depths of his memory. They did not belong here. He had buried them long ago. The forest shifted around him, or perhaps it was his mind. He was no longer walking beneath the canopy of Villidrun. Instead, he stood in a clearing from years past, watching as a younger version of himself desperately tried to escape a wild beast, a hulking mass of tusks and primal rage. Behind him, another hunter screamed, trapped beneath the weight of the creature's enormous paw. "Help me!" the trapped hunter cried, his voice raw with terror. But Riganthar had hesitated. His younger self turned, calculating the risks. He had made the rational choice to wound the beast, to drive it off instead of facing it head-on. He had survived. His companion had not. The clearing dissolved like smoke, and Riganthar stumbled, his breath coming in short, angry bursts. The whispers coiled around him, feeding off his guilt, pressing deeper. "You left him." A sharp snarl snapped him back to the present. Gurn was bristling, his massive frame low to the ground, tusks aimed forward. Riganthar followed the boar's gaze and saw movement in the shadows ahead. A creature emerged, half hidden by the twisted foliage. At first glance it resembled a stag, but its antlers were jagged, sharp and horribly twisted, resembling a crown of bone. Its eyes glowed an unnatural yellow, and its flesh was marred by patches of bark-like growths. The creature moved unnaturally, its limbs bending at angles that made Riganthar's skin crawl. It stepped closer, and he noticed something else. Its mouth hung open, whispering the same voices that had plagued him. "Why didn't you save him?" Riganthar didn't hesitate. He reached for his bow, loosing an arrow that struck true, burying itself in the creature's chest. The stag thing let out a scream, a sound too human for its form, before collapsing into the underbrush. Yet the whispers persisted, even as its body dissolved into a mass of writhing vines. The encounter left him rattled, but he pressed forward, forcing himself to ignore the whispers clawing at his resolve. Hours passed, though time felt warped in the forest's suffocating depths. The pair trudged through stagnant pools of blackened water and beneath archways of thorned vines that tore at the hunter's cloak. At one point, he stumbled across the remains of an animal, a doe, or what was left of one. Its body was swollen and split, overrun with twisting vein-like roots that sprouted from its eyes and mouth. He knelt by the corpse, studying it with a hunter's precision. The corruption was faster now, more aggressive this deep into the woods. Whatever lay at the forest's heart was gaining strength. As the oppressive shadows closed in, Riganthar found himself at the edge of a clearing. It was wrong, like everything else in this cursed forest, but different. The air here hummed with a malevolent energy, and the whispers were louder, insistent. He paused, one hand on Gurn's neck. "We'll camp here for the night," he said, though he knew neither he nor Gurn would find much rest. The clearing's twisted plants swayed without wind, and somewhere, deeper in the forest, a sound echoed, a low, resonant thrum like a heartbeat. Riganthar gritted his teeth and began to prepare. Whatever awaited him beyond this place, he would face it. Chapter 5. The Village of the Lost. Rising from a restless sleep, plagued by night terrors and dark hissing whispers, Riganthar pressed deeper into the forest's corrupted heart. Gurn walked beside him, the dire boar's massive tusks low to the ground, snout twitching. The oppressive weight of the air, thick and cloying, settled into Riganthar's chest like a sickness. The trees here were skeletal, their bark mottled with black veins. Some twisted upward in unnatural spirals, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. Others had faces, not carved but grown, horrific expressions of agony that seemed to watch and shift when Riganthar wasn't looking. Ahead, faint cries carried through the gloom. They were low and mournful, voices that sounded human but carried a distortion, as if dragged, echoing through a long tunnel. Riganthar tightened his grip on his axe, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows. The cries grew louder, resolving into a haunting symphony of sorrow as the hunter and his beast stepped into a clearing. At first, he thought the villagers were still alive. Shapes moved among the trees, people, or what had once been people. Their forms were grotesque, their bodies melded with the forest itself. One figure stumbled forward, its arms fused with branches, its legs entwined with twisting roots. Its face was partially intact, though its eyes glowed faintly green, and its mouth was a twisted gash that opened and closed in soundless wails. Riganthar froze. His breath caught as he took in the extent of their torment. These were not merely corrupted corpses, but living amalgamations of flesh and forest. Their movements were slow and jerky, as though the trees they were tethered to dictated their every step. A woman's face, partially enveloped by bark, turned toward him. Her lips moved as if to speak, but the words were garbled, vile and incomprehensible. "What madness is this?" Riganthar whispered, his voice swallowed by the thick air. Gurn growled low, his hackles rising, but he did not charge. The boar seemed unnerved, his usual fearlessness tempered by the overwhelming wrongness of the scene. Riganthar placed a steadying hand on Gurn's back. He stepped forward cautiously. The woman lurched closer, and as she did, the light filtering through the trees seemed to dim. She reached out, her wooden arm creaking, fingers ending in sharp twigs and raw bone. Riganthar noticed a crude pendant still hanging around her neck, a relic of her former humanity. "Stop," he commanded, his deep voice cutting through the muffled cries of the others. The woman hesitated, her movements jerking as though she struggled against unseen strings. Her glowing eyes fixed on him, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw recognition. Her lips moved again, and this time the sound came through. "Help!" The word was barely audible, a fragile thread of humanity dangling on the edge of oblivion. His throat tightened. He raised his axe, its sharp edge gleaming even in the dim light. "There is no help for you," he said quietly, his voice heavy with grim resolve. "I am sorry." The woman's eyes widened, glowing brighter, and her body convulsed violently. Roots erupted from the ground beneath her, wrapping around her legs, anchoring her to the spot. Her cry turned into a guttural roar, and the other villagers began to move, their sluggish forms suddenly energized. The clearing became a macabre dance of twisted limbs and rustling branches as the corrupted villagers closed in. Riganthar did not hesitate. His axe came down in a swift arc, severing the woman's wooden fleshy arm. She screamed, a sound that was both human and unholy, as the roots beneath her recoiled. Black sap spurted from the wound, steaming as it hit the ground. Gurn charged forward, his massive steel-tipped tusks goring and bursting apart another villager creature that lunged from the side. The fight was brutal. The hunter moved with the precision of a seasoned veteran, his axe cutting through bark and flesh alike. But with every swing he felt the weight of his actions. These were not mere beasts. They had once been people. Mothers, fathers, children. He recognized a young boy among them, his small body fused to a wooden frame, his face frozen in a silent scream. The whispers in the air grew louder, mocking him, accusing him. "You failed them," they seemed to say. "You will fail again." Riganthar gritted his teeth, his resolve hardening. He would not allow their suffering to spread. As the last of the creatures fell, Riganthar stood panting in the centre of the clearing, thick clouds of vapour escaping his lungs into the dark, cold, lifeless air. Black sap clung to his axe and spattered his leather armour. Around him the bodies of the villagers lay still, their twisted forms now inert. He knelt beside one of the fallen, a young man whose face was almost fully human, save for the bark that covered one side. He reached out, closing the man's lifeless eyes with a heavy hand. "I'm sorry," he muttered. His voice carried no emotion, but the sorrow in his eyes betrayed him. He rose, looking around the clearing. The whispers had faded, but their weight remained. Riganthar knew he was running out of time. The corruption was growing stronger the deeper he went. If these villagers had suffered this fate, the source of the evil was close. "Come, Gurn," he said, his voice low. "The heart of this madness lies ahead." As they left the clearing, the twisted trees seemed to watch them, their bark faces locked in expressions of agony. The forest, it seemed, mourned with him. Chapter 6. Heart of the Forest. The air thickened almost to a foul pace as Riganthar and Gurn approached the heart of the forest, a stifling miasma of rot and decay. Every step forward was met with resistance, not just from the gnarled roots that clawed and grabbed at his boots, but from the forest itself, which seemed to push back against his presence. A low, pulsating hum resonated through the ground, vibrating up through his feet and into his bones, as though the land itself was alive and spiteful. The trees here were unlike any he'd encountered before. Their bark was slick with a black, oily substance that dripped in slow rivulets, and their branches curled inward like claws shielding some terrible secret. The blackened trunks creaked with a noise more akin to painful cries and sobs of woe, as opposed to any familiar sound one would expect. Riganthar's hand tightened on the haft of his axe. Even the trees were suffering. Gurn snorted uneasily. The dire boar pawed at the ground, trampling away at the underbrush. Riganthar placed a steadying hand on Gurn's thick, bristled hide, but his own unease grew with every step. Whispers, faint at first, grew louder the closer they drew, seeping into his mind like poison, their syllables jagged and alien, tugging at his memories, his regrets. "You failed them. You are no saviour. Turn back. You cannot win." He shook his head, growling low in his throat, but the whispers only grew stronger. Each voice was different, some mocking, others pleading, some sobbing uncontrollably. He clenched his jaw, forcing his focus forward. The forest around him began to shift, subtly at first. A path he was sure had been behind him now veered to the left. Trees moved when he wasn't looking, twisting into new positions. He could feel unseen eyes watching, lurking just beyond the corner of his vision. When he broke through the final thicket, the sight before him stole his breath. The clearing stretched wide, unnaturally open, as though the forest dared not encroach on what lay at its centre. The ground here was barren and cracked, the blackened soil pulsing faintly with a sickly red glow. At the very centre, atop a mound of twisted roots and bones, lay the hand. It was immense, easily twice the size of a man, its clawed fingers curled as if in sleep. The flesh was shriveled but not decayed, its surface black and veined with dimly glowing crimson tattoo lines that pulsed in rhythm with the hum of the earth. The air around it shimmered like heat rising from a flame, but instead of warmth, an icy chill seeped into Riganthar's very marrow. The whispers became a chorus now, unbearable screams that made his head pound. Gurn let out a low, guttural growl, his hackles raised. The boar stomped the ground, but even he seemed reluctant to move closer. Riganthar knelt, steadying himself, his breath visible in the cold air despite the oppressive weight of the clearing. He reached out, brushing his fingers against the corrupted soil. Pain flared through his hand like fire, and he jerked back, his fingers trembling. The land itself rejected him. As he rose, the clearing seemed to ripple. Shadows poured from the trees, slithering along the ground like snakes. They gathered at the base of the mound, twisting and congealing into a mass that began to rise. The thing that formed had no clear shape, only a writhing collection of limbs, eyes and mouths, all fused together in grotesque harmony. Its eyes were countless, glowing like embers, and its mouths spewed forth screams, louder now, almost deafening. Riganthar's grip tightened on his axe, his breath steady despite the horror before him. "You will not have this land," he said, his voice low but firm. The thing screeched in response, a sound that scraped against his mind like nails on stone. The ground beneath him shuddered as the abomination lunged toward him on multiple half-developed limbs. Riganthar dove to the side, his axe coming up to cleave one of its limbs, a spindly clawed thing that looked half-formed, as though it had been ripped from several creatures and stitched together by madness. The limb fell, but two more took its place, bursting from the writhing mass with sickening pops and gushes of the now familiar black ichor. Gurn charged with a bellowing roar, his tusks striking deep. The creature recoiled, its many mouths crying out as its eyes widened in pain. Black ichor sprayed across the clearing, sizzling as it hit the ground. The hunter took the opening, swinging his axe in a wide arc that severed several more limbs, but the creature was relentless. For every piece he cut away, it seemed to grow another and swell in size. The screams grew sharper, angrier, driving into his skull as the battle raged on. He could feel them trying to break him as his injuries began to take their toll. He could feel them trying to drag him into the despair that birthed this monstrosity. Images flashed in his mind, his failures, his losses, the lives he couldn't save. But he held on to one truth: he was still standing, just. With a bloody roar, he hurled a vial of fire oil given to him by the druid. It struck the creature, igniting in a burst of flame and lava. The abomination writhed, its form losing cohesion, melting into the shadows it had sprung from. Riganthar wasted no time. He approached the mound, his body screaming in protest with every step. The hand pulsed violently now, as if sensing its doom. The screams became a single, desperate voice, pleading with him to stop. But Riganthar raised his axe high, summoning every ounce of strength left in his body. "Your evil ends here," he growled. The axe fell, and the clearing exploded with a shockwave of dark energy rippling through the hunter's already devastated body. Chapter 7. Legacy of the Beast King. The villagers arrived in solemn procession, their faces pale and their breaths shallow, as though the air itself was too heavy with grief to fill their lungs. They followed the druid, their gnarled staff glowing faintly, casting flickering shadows along the newly healed forest floor. Though the corruption had lifted, the scars of its passage remained. Trees, no longer twisted, stood bare and skeletal, their bark etched with veins of ash. The ground was pocked with craters where roots once writhed, and the silence of the forest carried a weight that was neither peace nor relief. At the centre of a sunlit glade, they found him. Riganthar was slumped against the massive trunk of an ancient oak, his lifeless body resting as if in quiet vigil. His face, lined with age and hardship, bore a serene expression, a strange counterpoint to the ichor-stained axes resting across his lap. His mighty hands, once capable of felling the fiercest beasts, were now still, their grip loosened in death. Beside him lay Gurn, the dire boar, whose massive form shielded its master even to the bitter end. The beast's tusks were chipped and bloodied, its sides heaving faintly with the final vestiges of life. The druid approached first, their expression inscrutable beneath the shadow of their hood. They knelt before Riganthar and placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the faint rustle of leaves like cries of mourning. "He gave himself," they murmured, their voice low and reverent, "to cleanse the heart of the forest. Yet even in death he guards it still." The villagers dared not speak. They stood in a loose circle, their eyes darting between the great hunter's still form and the surrounding glade. Though the corruption was gone, an oppressive unease lingered, as though the ground itself remembered the malice it once held. One villager, a young farmer, broke the silence. "He saved us, all of us." His voice cracked, but he stepped forward, placing a hand over his heart in a gesture of respect. "What will become of him now?" The druid rose, their movements deliberate, their hooded gaze sweeping over the gathered crowd. "We will give him to the forest. He will not be forgotten, for his name will linger in the leaves, the roots, the wind." The villagers worked in silence, digging a grave beneath the great oak's sprawling roots. The soil, dark and rich, seemed to embrace their hands, as if eager to reclaim the body of its defender. They laid Riganthar within, his axes resting crossed atop his chest. Gurn, who had passed moments before the grave was complete, was placed at his side, the loyal companion inseparable even in death. When the final handful of earth was placed, the druid stepped forward once more. They held a small vial of glowing liquid, life essence gathered from the purged corruption. With a quiet chant, they poured it over the mound. The ground shimmered faintly, and wild flowers began to bloom, their petals ghostly white and soft as the morning mist. The villagers marked the grave with a simple carving on the oak's trunk. Riganthar, Beast King, Protector of the Wilds. As the group prepared to leave, the wind stirred, carrying a faint, unearthly sound. It was neither a boar's growl nor a hunter's chant, but something in between, a lingering echo of the Beast King's presence. The villagers looked to the druid, who nodded. "The forest remembers," they said softly. They departed, their footsteps muted by the forest floor, leaving the glade to its quiet guardianship. Yet as the last villager vanished into the trees, the shadows in the glade seemed to deepen. Though the corruption had been purged, its scars ran deep, and the land bore its weight like a wound not fully healed. Above the grave, the oak's branches trembled, their leaves whispering to one another in a language older than time. And far below, in the loam and roots, something pulsed faintly, a remnant of darkness, too small to see, too quiet to hear. The forest was healing, but it would never forget.